All right. I think we've got a good number of people who have joined now. So we'll go ahead and start with our program. So welcome everyone. For the SAVE Act is back. What nonprofits can do about it. My name is Gwen Stembridge, and I am the Education and Partnerships Director at Nonprofit Vote. And we're so excited for this conversation today. Like I said, if you are a policy nerd, you are in the right place. We're going to talk about some of these policies, how they impact communities, and how they impact your work as a nonprofit leader. So let's get started. First thing I wanted to just remind you of is that this webinar is being recorded and will be sent out along with the slides after the webinar is over. It may be a couple of days as we just adjust things on our side, but do expect to get that in your email, even if you've just registered for the webinar. Also, please do put questions in the Q&A section of the webinar. So for those of you less familiar with Zoom, at the bottom of your screen, you'll have a black bar that will have the Q&A symbol there. So please do put your questions there. We will have a Q&A section at the end of the webinar. And so it really helps us to stay organized if the questions are all in that place, because we want to be able to get to all of your really good questions that we know you're going to have. So please do put those in that place as opposed to putting them in the chat or somewhere else. Again, just really is about helping us stay organized so that we can make sure we answer your questions as they come. With that said, any chat, any conversations, your introductions, if you have comments, if you have resources to share in the chat, we welcome those. Please share those in the chat. If you say, oh, I'm from this state, I'm doing this work, I'm from this state, I'm doing this work. We love to see those connections happen. This is one of the beautiful things about having a national webinar with so many partners from across the country, as that you all can also connect with one another in this space. And then, as always, we really do encourage encouragements or reactions as you go through this. If you really appreciate something that one of our distinguished speakers is saying, please do share that love there. There's a reaction button. You can share those as well. And then closed captioning is available via Zoom. So there's, again, a button at the bottom of that black bar that you should be able to access that. Wanted to give you just a little overview of what our time today will look like. I'll give you a little bit of an overview of who Nonprofit Vote is, a little bit of an overview of what the SAVE Act is, and then I'll introduce our speakers. We'll have a discussion. We'll have some audience Q&A time. And then I come to this work as a community organizer and cannot leave you all without a call to action. So a call to action, and we actually do have some exciting pieces we'll send your way, and then we'll wrap everything up at the top of the hour. So to just start you out here, some of you all might be brand new to Nonprofit Vote. Some of you may have been here. This may be your 10th, 11th, 20th webinar that you've been to with us. But as a reminder, Nonprofit Vote is here to support you, 501c3 nonprofits who are doing any kind of voter engagement, from the really simple things like amplifying the information from your county board of elections to more integrated things like doing voter registration at any of the outreach events that you all are doing as an organization, or maybe you're doing candidate engagement and hosting a candidate survey or a candidate forum. We are here to support you through that whole range of different types of activities that you're doing. And that work is really to produce a more inclusive democracy and build a more inclusive democracy where all those voices can be heard. And we know that you all as nonprofit leaders have the relationships, have the trust within your community to be able to do that. And we are here to be your toolbox and your friend to walk alongside you and support you in that work. Here's a little bit of background now on the SAVE Act and how it impacts nonprofits. So this is a lot of text. Again, this will be sent to you afterward. But the SAVE Act, the Save America Act, formerly known as just the SAVE Act, stands for the Safeguarding of American Voter Eligibility Act. The stated intention is to prevent non-citizens from voting. But current law is really that non-citizens are not allowed to vote. So this makes it a little bit curious. Most common documents that people use for ID do not provide a proof of citizenship, your driver's license, even real ID in most states, student IDs, utility bills, all of that does not necessarily provide documentary proof of citizenship. And so in order to provide an acceptable ID under this bill, there's additional financial and time burden that would be placed on voters. And then the impact on nonprofits could be that nonprofits, other organizations with a track record of successfully registering voters, like many of you all are doing, would have to really focus that time on teaching people these new laws, how to get access to these IDs, and perhaps supporting them with the finances to do that, because many of you all also help people to access IDs when they need to. Time would be taken away then from doing other voter education work that you're already doing. And then another just piece of this bill is that a concern about this bill is that there's no funding allocation to those agencies as of now to process that additional paperwork. So just some things to think about as we go into this. So that's a little bit of background for you, but really we brought the experts here to dive into the details. So some of you all attended our webinar last year on the SAVE Act. And so two of these faces at least will be familiar to you. We have Andrew Garber, who is the Voting Rights and Elections Program Counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice. Brennan Center is known for being on the front lines of democracy work. And so we're really thrilled to have him on board again. And then we've got Daniel Griffith, who is the Senior Director of Policy at the Secure Democracy Foundation, also really on the front lines of this work in tracking some of these bills, also has access and has been looking not just at the SAVE Act on the national level, but also at some of these bills happening at the state level. And so we're really paying attention to that as the SAVE Act has passed the House. It has moved to the Senate. We're not sure what will happen there, but we do know that in the meantime, there are states that are considering these types of bills. So Daniel will be able to speak to that a little bit as well. And then our third panelist here is Olivia Zink, who is the Executive Director of Open Democracy New Hampshire. New Hampshire is one of the states that passed a documentary proof of citizenship bill in 2024. And so she is really equipped to speak to how they as an organization have adjusted the way that they're doing their work and how that bill's passage has impacted the state and their communities. So really thrilled to welcome these three speakers, and we'll move now into our discussion. So thrilled that you all are here. One of the first things I would love to do is just start you all out. Just tell us a little bit about you and about your work, and maybe a little bit about how you've already interacted with the SAVE Act. Would love to start with Andrew. I'll pass it to Daniel and then to Olivia.
All right. Thank you, Gwen, and everyone for being here. Really excited to get to join and talk to you all about this important issue. As Gwen said, I'm Andrew Garber. I work on the Voting Rights and Elections team here at the Brennan Center. The Brennan Center is a legal services provider and think tank that focuses on restoring and advancing our democracy. So, in other words, we do a lot of work to make sure that the right to vote is upheld and is available to everyone equally. We do a lot of work to protect elections against those who seek to undermine them, destroy confidence in them. Teammates I have on other programs do all sorts of things in the criminal justice space, on presidential power to make sure we have a fully functioning democracy that works for everyone. What that work looks like takes many different forms. Sometimes I get the opportunity to participate in events like this and work with people and different stakeholders in different fields on many of the pressing issues. Today, of course, being on the SAVE Act. In other cases, we will go to court, we will litigate to protect voting rights or try to stop threats to our elections. We will do legislative advocacy, including a lot that I and many of my teammates have done on the SAVE Act to work with members of Congress and their staffs to understand what the implications of a bill like this would be, to understand what will really happen if they pass this bill and why it's so important that they don't. The Brennan Center also has a large research and policy development arm, so we're frequently thinking about what is a question in the elections and voting space that needs to be answered? What kind of information will help people do their jobs, will help election officials and poll workers do their jobs? And we'll frequently put out reports to support those things as we try to continue to think of ways to make our democracy better and more accessible for everyone.
Thanks so much, Andrew. On to you.
Thank you so much. My name is Daniel Griffith. Good to see everyone again. And for those who are joining the first time, I'm the Senior Director of Policy of the Secure Democracy Foundation. We are an organization that really focuses on the preeminent constitutional role that states play in administering our elections. Framers made it pretty clear that states should be running their own elections, and we certainly endorse that point of view through our work. We are a research and advocacy organization that is determined to build stronger elections state by state. So we do that through a number of ways. Some of you might be familiar with our sister C3 organization, the Voting Rights Lab. And through them, we do a lot of research, including maintaining our election policy tracker, which is free to join for everyone, tracker.votingrightslab.org. Just have to leave your email address. That is a tool in which we track every piece of election-related legislation running through all 50 states and DC. It's sortable in terms of if you want to look at bills that look like the SAVE Act on the proof of citizenship thing, then you can pick those out versus if you want to see bills about voting by mail or voter ID or some of the other pieces that you hear discussed around the SAVE Act or Save America Act or MEGA Act or all of the other things. Those are all things that you can look at in terms of things that are going at the state level. We also are engaged in legislative advocacy in our 10-state portfolio. And we've had the experience of working on, these state level, call them clones, call them mutations of the SAVE Act around this issue of proof of citizenship. In New Hampshire, which I know Olivia is going to talk about, in Florida, which just passed a bill like this, in Texas, which came very close to doing so last year. We really have a lot of insight in terms of how state actors and state allies of the Trump administration are looking at this issue of proof of citizenship and trying to find ways, with the SAVE Act, still and hopefully remaining stuck in Congress, trying to find ways to bring some of those, restrictions to the state level, kind of taking their marching orders from the president. So working on what those look like, what might be avenues to attack those, to prevent those, to mitigate those, but also in the states that ultimately enact this legislation, how we can educate voters to know what they need to do to make sure that while they will definitely have disenfranchising impacts, limiting those as much as possible.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Yes, Olivia.
Olivia Zink, Executive Director at Open Democracy in New Hampshire. We're a nonpartisan nonprofit, and we work on campaign finance, redistricting, and ensuring that everyone has the freedom to vote in our state. And we work on really making sure that voters are educated in our state, working specifically with high school students who are newly 18, getting them to register to vote, but also have an Age Strong program with voters that have disabilities or voters that may need additional support to cast a ballot. We also do a lot of different education, organizing, and leadership development to ensure that everyone's voice matters, as well as doing some poll worker and poll observer programs to make sure elections in our state are protected. I'll hand it back to Gwen.
Thanks so much, everyone. As you can see, we've got some experts here and excited to dive into the conversation. I will start us off with just a little disclaimer, a reminder that this is a nonpartisan conversation, that we are focusing on issues today. And it is okay to comment on the current legislation that is in play. The other thing I'll just remind folks of is that nothing in this webinar is legal advice. Even if there are attorneys that are here, they are not your attorneys unless you already have that established, but nothing here should be construed as legal advice. Great. If you have questions, if you are interested in that, if you seek an attorney, I'm sure that there are some resources that we can point you to in the chat. We're great friends with Alliance for Justice, and they have a great assistance line. And then also, I'm sure Brennan Center and others could help you if you reach out, get you to the right place. Excellent. So wanted to just start out our first question of the discussion here by just naming that this is not the first time that we've seen the SAVE Act introduced. Can you tell us, this is really to you, Andrew, but I welcome Daniel or Olivia, your input as well. This is not the first time we've seen this. What is new this time with the Save America Act? Including recent amendments. I know there have been lots of changes even here in the last couple of weeks. What are some of those recent amendments, and within all of that, what are the legal implications of it all?
Sure, happy to take that one. So the current version of the bill that passed the House and is now being considered in the Senate is, as Gwen said, called the Save America Act. I'm going to describe what's in the version currently being considered in the Senate. It has had some recent amendments. I'll mention what those are as I get to them. And there's a possibility that there could be further amendments for anyone who follows what happens in the Senate. It is a very confusing place with lots of parliamentary goings on, and it's been a really fluid situation. So some of this information, in the next 24 hours, in the next couple of weeks, could continue to evolve. But the Save America Act primarily, it's about a few different things. Unfortunately, there's a number of harmful provisions in there, but the one that seems to be its headliner is about requiring all American citizens to provide a passport or a birth certificate or a similar document establishing citizenship in order to be able to register to vote or anytime you re-register to vote. 21 million American citizens lack these documents, including millions of active voters. Only half of Americans have a passport, for example. Millions of people don't have a paper copy of their birth certificate. I'm sure even many people in this meeting today don't know where their birth certificate is. That is unfortunately common, but this bill wouldn't really take any heed of that and would require you to have one of those documents in hand to be able to register to vote, or if you just changed your address and need to update it, same thing. This bill will be harmful to a lot of different constituencies. One that I think is really important to note is people whose names on their birth certificate might not match their current names. That includes millions and millions of women who changed their names when they got married. It involves people, including survivors of domestic violence, who have changed their name, transgender individuals. There are a lot of people to whom this would harm, not to mention a lot of groups such as Native American voters or lower income voters, where getting these types of documents can be a huge hurdle. I think it's really important to note as well that this is a solution in search of a problem. There is no evidence of non-citizens voting in our elections. And in fact, recently, states like Louisiana and Utah have undertaken huge efforts to try to find the supposed non-citizens in the rolls. They came away with nothing. Utah has about 1.8 million registered voters. They found one non-citizen on their rolls, literally one. So, all these hurdles that are being put in place aren't being done to solve a real problem. I think it's really important to note as well, I know this is something important to a lot of people here, this bill would upend existing forms of voter registration. If you're registering to vote by mail, well, now you need to go in person and present the necessary documentation. So mail registration, as a functional matter, will be gone. Voter registration drives, those will become extremely difficult, if not impossible. How is someone to show an election official their passport or birth certificate if they're registering to vote at a voter registration drive? This is something the bill doesn't pay any attention to, and again, would make voter registration drives near impossible to run, that's a huge hurdle and a huge problem as so many people are registered across the country every year through voter registration drives. Same with online voting. You can imagine how the similar challenges apply, as well as automatic voter registration that takes place at departments of motor vehicles across the country. That would be something that would be significantly curtailed as well. Similarly, it's worth mentioning this is a huge unfunded mandate for election officials. They have to figure out how to implement these systems. They have to figure out all the details. And if this passes in the next few months, it's primary season already. The November election is a few months away. It's going to be a lot of trouble for them to figure it out during that time. Now, in terms of some of the newer provisions in the Save America Act, there's a few that I want to run through. One of them involves state voter rolls. This bill would require all states to turn over their voter rolls to DHS. Why? Well, DHS has said they want to run the voter rolls through what's known as the SAVE program, which is a program used to check whether or not someone is a citizen when they sign up for benefits or entitlements. It is not a citizenship database. Lots of people aren't in there, and there are plenty of people in there who were marked as non-citizens who have since become a citizen. So it's really not fit for the purpose of checking the voter rolls. And when some states have done it over the past couple of years, we've seen them get really flawed results, things that are just clearly incorrect on their face. There's also reason to believe DHS wants to use this information for other reasons, including to support deportation efforts. Currently, the federal government has demanded the voter rolls from almost every state. It's sued about 30 of them to try to get them. So that is a real threat in this bill as well. I want to mention the voter ID provisions in the Save America Act. Those are new from what we saw in the Save Act last year. This would be the strictest voter ID policy in the country. Maybe Ohio's is about as restrictive as this one, but there is a very, very small number of documents you can use when you go to vote. And there are very few safeguards to help protect people who don't have or cannot access those documents. So this isn't any voter ID provision. This is a really, really strict one. Last couple things worth mentioning. I know I've been talking for a few minutes. Mail voting. The Save America Act, because of an amendment introduced in the Senate a couple weeks ago, would eliminate access to mail voting for almost all Americans. It would say you have to vote in person unless you are serving in the military, experiencing an illness or disability, being away for the entire period of voting, including all of the early voting in your state, or if you face another, quote, hardship that makes it impracticable for you to vote. Well, what does all that mean? Well, first of all, the bill specifically says to construe these things narrowly. In other words, whenever there's a question, election officials should err on the side of you not being allowed to vote by mail. It's also really harsh in how it applies these exceptions. You have to request your mail ballot at least 14 days before the election. So if you get sick in the run up to the election, you're out of luck. If you have work or family obligations pop up and you have to leave town, that's too bad. You can't vote by mail. You have to have a doctor's note, or you have to provide copies of your travel plans to get a mail ballot. Some of the stuff is just absolutely crazy. It's putting in hurdle after hurdle. It is doing everything it can to stop you from being able to vote by mail. The bill would also compel states to engage in faulty voter purges. It'll kick people who are eligible, correctly registered American citizens off the rolls. And it creates criminal penalties for election officials for when they get things wrong. That is just another reason officials will be forced to interpret the bill harshly, to interpret it against voters. And that is, we've seen over the last few years, election officials leaving office in droves. We've lost so much experience because of all the attacks they faced, all the threats, all the intimidation they have faced. And the federal Congress needs to be doing things to protect our election officials, not making their lives harder, not doing more things to prevent them from doing their jobs.
Yes, well said, Andrew. That is there are a lot of issues with it. Thank you for giving that comprehensive overview. I'm curious now. I want to turn to Daniel and also Andrew. If you've got some pieces of this, I welcome that as well. But where else have we seen bills like this across the country, and how do they differ at all from the Save Act or the Save America Act?
It would be easier to list the states where we haven't seen bills like this, to be honest. It's
Fair
certainly,
enough.
a trend that we've really been seeing, on the rise the last several years. Just thinking about our work with the election policy tracker, we noted that in 2022, there were maybe 6 states that were running bills that had, this sort of proof of citizenship component where everyone had to affirmatively provide documentation to prove their citizenship at the point of registration. And we've seen a steady increase. Last year, there were over 24 states where this was running. Still a lot of states where it is running and unfortunately passing in some states this year as well. In the past few years, we've seen bills passed in New Hampshire, which I know Olivia will talk about, Wyoming, Louisiana, certainly there. And then in this current legislative session, we're seeing bills that have passed and are sitting on the governor's desk in Utah, South Dakota, and Florida. Um, they look a little different in many ways from the SAVE Act. I think one different aspect of the state bills as opposed to what's required in the SAVE Act is that the states do generally have the advantage of being able to coordinate the information between their motor vehicle department and election officials, which in the best case scenario, the motor vehicle department is going to have a lot of that verifying information that the SAVE Act just calls for the voter to affirmatively provide. Still a burden on voters, but maybe, if things work the way they're supposed to, which is a big if, maybe lessening that burden to a certain extent. I mean, the way that these bills are explained by the proponents is that, well, DMV has been collecting this information since 2017, and here I'm talking about this is the way that it was talked about in Florida, which just passed its version. We've been collecting this information since 2017. We're getting everybody real ID compliant. So for 99% of our state ID holders, we should have this information, should be able to matriculate it over to the Department of State, and the Department of State should be able to matriculate it down to county supervisors who are responsible for registering voters and maintaining their voter rolls. That's a lot of theory. So what this is going to look like in practice, I think, is still something that's very something that we'll be paying a lot of attention to. Just speaking about the individual bills that we're seeing lately. The Florida bill, I think the first thing to call out just from an education standpoint, just so everyone is aware, it has some proof of citizenship components. It has some voter ID components that are kind of similar to the Save America Act as well. But those aren't scheduled to go into effect until January of next year. They will not be in effect for midterms in Florida, primaries, or the general election. But what that bill looks like is kind of the way I described it. It's supposed to coordinate through the DHS&V, which is the motor vehicle authority there. In a perfect world, they're able to confirm the citizenship information, but for a lot of folks, that's not going to happen. And for the folks that doesn't happen for, they're going to have to go through the same sort of rigmarole with the SAVE Act of get a birth certificate, get a passport, which, a lot of folks are not going to have access to. So, you can certainly expect that despite all state efforts to try to make it easier on voters for these bills, that there are going to be folks who are, eligible citizens who are going to be left out on the margins in terms of their ability to vote. Those who have to follow up are probably going to have to pay money to get a birth certificate. For a lot of folks from Florida who may have moved in from another state, getting a birth certificate from out of state can be a real burden. Obviously, passports aren't cheap. And also they're pretty slow to get processed these days as well. So, that's another thing to kind of think about as well with these. So, for those folks, that's a lot of things that they'll have to worry about. Another aspect of the Florida legislation that we're looking at is folks who are familiar with state level proof of citizenship regimes, like the way Arizona's been doing it for 20 years. Because of the way the Supreme Court's weighed in on these issues, Arizona has what's called a bifurcated system, where for federal elections, as long as you attest that you're a citizen, you don't have to follow with proof of citizenship and you're allowed to vote in those elections. But for their state elections, they do require that full proof of citizenship component. The Florida bill isn't doing that. The Florida bill, if they're unable to verify your citizenship. They're not going to allow you to vote in any elections, which we certainly anticipate seeing. It'd be one of the several things about that Florida legislation that we expected litigation on as soon as it's signed into law. The Utah and South Dakota bills are pretty similar in terms of the um, coordination with the Motor Vehicle Authority. One thing that we're seeing, which is its own hornet's nest, both in the Florida legislation and in the South Dakota legislation, is the idea of placing citizenship markers on driver's license and IDs that are issued by the state, which, certainly folks are aware of some of the issues with respect to that. South Dakota has been doing that since 2025. Part of the Florida legislation is that they're going to start doing that with IDs that are issued in 2027. The idea there is to try to address, at least one of those criticisms of the SAVE Act, most notably around Real ID. A lot of folks are familiar with the notion that most state level forms of Real ID compliant IDs don't indicate that someone is a citizen. It usually just means you're lawfully present if you have the star, or I think California has like a bear or something in the corner. Except for a few states that have what's called an enhanced ID. There's only 5 right now. So the states are certainly trying to, address that criticism in a way where the IDs may affirmatively show that someone's a citizen, but that runs into, a lot of issues around privacy and the reliability of the data as well. So we indicate that we're certainly watching all of these things in implementation, and even in the case of Florida, where it's going to go into effect next year. Hopefully there's some runway leading up to the 2028 election where, if problems inevitably, and they will, present themselves, there might be a way to address some of these issues in the legislative process if there's the political will to do so. So we'll be certainly watching the implementation and hopefully making, that system as, less cumbersome for the voters as it can be.
Yeah, thank you. This is a balance of state and federal law, because usually these election laws are made by the states and are controlled at the state level, but this is really a reach from the federal level. So as we think about the impacts of these bills, you all have named that there are some consequences that might come from this for individuals, for voters, for folks who have been voting for many, many years, for folks who are interested in maybe becoming first-time voters, and then also for the nonprofits that are supporting them in doing that, right? So many organizations are doing that. Can you talk to us a little bit? I'm going to toss this to Olivia first. Can you talk to us about what are some of the unintended consequences that you're seeing, especially in New Hampshire, now that a similar bill has passed there?
Yeah, so I'll first talk about, I just popped a story in the chat from a woman who was trying to register to vote at town meeting in New Hampshire and was unable to do so because she didn't have her marriage certificate. She had a birth certificate, but her birth certificate and driver's license didn't match. And we also have seen stories of voters, a 90-year-old voter who sold their home and moved into a retirement community, was unable to cast a ballot even though he's been voting his entire life because he didn't have a birth certificate, and his name was purged from the list when he moved from his home to the nursing home. So he wasn't able to be looked up in our voter lookup system here in New Hampshire. But also people who have been adopted, and a lot of brand new 18-year-old voters. Many of them don't know where their birth certificate is, or their parents. I loved this. My mom put it in a really safe place, but doesn't know where that safe place is. So had to go apply for another birth certificate in order to register to vote. And so I think that these are just real people that have been impacted by this new law. Last year, our election observers through our nonpartisan coalition observed over 244 people that weren't able to cast a ballot. So these are real people that weren't able to cast a ballot. And this is lower turnout municipal elections. Our law didn't go into effect until after the general election in 2024, so we're sort of seeing it in real time. We were able to work with our state legislature to amend the law. It's sort of a little Band-Aid fix so that documents could be looked up in the DMV if the government does have access to the documents. So less people were able to, in the March town meetings that we just had, over 200 voters were looked up and able to cast ballots, but there were still, I think, 32 turned away that we're aware of in our poll observing programs. So I think it's important for us to know that it doesn't matter what party these voters are. That older gentleman I spoke of was a Republican, an independent, a Democrat. It affects all voters who may have changed their names, who may have moved, who may not have access. And in New Hampshire, we only have 3 ways to prove citizenship, which is your passport, your birth certificate, or your naturalization paperwork. So we're limited to those 3 options. And if you don't have them or they're not able to look them up, then you're unable to vote on election day. So it's really important people understand and the new laws as they've been passed. And not many people walk around with a copy of their birth certificate. So needing to re-educate folks that they'll need to bring those with them for voting purposes.
Yeah, thank you. And I would guess that those are not consequences that have been anticipated by most of us, right? But you, like the gentleman you spoke about, you kind of get to the polls, you think, I've been voting my whole life, this shouldn't be an issue, and then suddenly you're unable to. So that is definitely an issue. Andrew, Daniel, do you want to speak? Are there any other just kind of unintended consequences or just impacts of this that our audience should know about or kind of be prepared for if this were to pass?
I'll hammer again just the point about election officials. Daniel mentioned in his rundown of the states, Louisiana in 2024 passed one of these laws that basically says, Secretary of State, go do this. They haven't implemented that 2 years later. And I'm not in the Louisiana Secretary of State's office. I can't tell you why they haven't, but I suspect one possibility is that these are really hard things to implement. You have to come up with whole new systems for cross-checking things. As Daniel talked about, you have to make state databases that don't talk to each other, talk to each other. That's complex. That's hard. Election officials are not getting funding to do these things. These are things that are run at the county or the town or the city level. And secretaries of state play very important support and leadership roles, but they aren't actually administering things day to day. And so I think we're going to see, if this passes, a lot of chaos, a lot of huge challenges to get things figured out. And unfortunately, like Olivia was talking about in New Hampshire, we're going to see play out across the country. That's going to impact who knows how many voters, who knows how many people are going to be completely discouraged because they show up and it's a super long line. And that because of all these things going on, and they show up and they don't have the right thing, and they don't have time to come back a second time. So it's easy to dismiss some of these concerns, or it's easy to say, oh, officials can just figure it out. But that's just not how it works when you get under the hood. Elections are very, very big project to run with a lot of moving parts. And this is just sticking a wrench in the gears, without any systems, without having thought through how to make it function smoothly.
Yeah, thank you. Yep. That's what we're seeing for sure. Wanted to talk now about some maybe next steps for communities that are seeing a similar bill introduced in their state. You all have mentioned lots of pieces that can be really great talking points if there are organizations that want to talk to their legislators about a bill like this that may be coming to their state legislature, or if you're interested in contacting one of your U.S. senators about this issue and about this bill as they consider it. But what are some of those steps that communities who are seeing that similar bill, what are some of those steps that they could take? This could go to actually any of you all.
I'll just say to work in coalition with coalition partners to make sure voters of different population are getting targeted lists, targeted outreach. So whether it's somebody in a nursing home, whether it's somebody with a disability, somebody in a nursing home, a domestic violence shelter or homeless shelter, just sort of coordinating with allies around your community to make sure that you're getting as much information out. I saw that there was somebody here from a local library. That's another great place to put up posters or information or collect stories about how people are impacting and how people are perceiving these new rules changes. But voter education, voter education, voter education, and communicate as much with your elected officials. Call your elected officials, tell them why these provisions are harmful to not just one population, not just young people who may not have documents, but everyone. I mean, you never know who's going to have a house fire and lose a birth certificate. It can really impact anyone.
I'm definitely second Olivia's comments about working in coordination with the state coalitions and the state tables on this work. But I would also raise up the point that, especially to Gwen's question about what to do if we see these bills in the legislature, is, I mean, to put not too fine a point on it, make it as painful as possible for them to actually pass this legislation. So clog the phone lines of your local legislature later with, stories of how this is going to have a real world impact on you or the organization or the members of your organization, in terms of, making sure that eligible citizens have every, possible access to the ballot. If your state legislature allows for folks to come in and testify, show up in numbers. I definitely, remember certainly some legislative fights, thinking of some things we've seen in Texas before where hundreds of people will show up and make that hearing last all day long and into the night. And, those folks have to, understand what's going on. Will it, change the trajectory? Maybe not. But use every tool at your disposal. There's a lot more to participating in democracy than just casting your vote, when elections come around. And that's certainly one that everyone should be using as much as they can.
Absolutely. I think this is where the nonprofit power manifests, is in those partnerships. We know as nonprofit professionals that folks are busy. There is a lot that is happening, but if you work together, if if your organization has a bus that you use to transport seniors to appointments, and you can work with another organization to bring a group of people to the state house, then coordinate with one another and work together and be in communication about this, because it is impacting. It is impacting especially vulnerable populations. When you mentioned, Olivia, folks who have been adopted, that is not one that was even a population of folks that was on my radar. I learned about that just now. And so I think there's a lot of, again, unintended consequences that can come from this that we really need to be aware of. So thank you all so much. We have, as you might imagine, quite a few questions that are in the Q&A box. So thank you, folks, for being really engaged and adding a lot of questions to the Q&A box. So I want to start out here with a few of these. A few of these might be a little more legal in nature, but and some of them might be a little more specific. So I'll toss this out to whoever I think is most relevant, but you all please jump in. So someone asked about pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds and registering 18-year-olds to vote. Under the SAVE Act, would we still be able to do this?
I can start us off there. One thing the SAVE Act does not do is provide a lot of clarity on all these sorts of questions. I think you've asked a very good question, and you've hit on a very important issue, which is that the voter registration takes a lot of different forms across the 50 states in our country, and the SAVE Act does not account for that. So a lot of the question becomes, how will your local election official choose to implement this part of the bill? Will it be enough if a 17-year-old shows their birth certificate that they can be pre-registered to vote at 18? My read of the bill is that that's probably okay, but I want to reemphasize there are criminal penalties on election officials in this bill if they get this wrong. It's asking a lot for election officials to fill in the gaps in ways that are favorable to voters. That's one of the many unfortunate things about this bill. And it's also one of the reasons that there are a lot of parts of this bill that I think are legally questionable. We will certainly see a lot of lawsuits, many of which I think will have quite a bit of merit. And there are going to be a lot of unintended consequences with who this bill impacts. Whoever asked this question, you've identified a really good one, which is to say, probably states can still do pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds, but how they can do that and who will be willing to do that is something that we won't know until, if this bill were to pass, the implementation of it started.
Yeah, I
And I'll
think
just say some states allow for 16 and 17-year-olds to be automatically added to the list. In our state, in New Hampshire, you have to be 17 by the next election. And so the rules really do depend state by state on sort of that age and also what other documents that students have to provide to show where they live, not just citizenship too. So
yeah, I think I would add, to Andrew's point about really the lack of clarity about how the proof of citizenship process would work in the registration process. And I've seen it come up in some of the questions in the Q&A. There's other aspects of the registration process that are really in question based on what the Save America Act would require, thinking about third-party voter registration, which I know a lot of folks who are on the call engage in. How does that work with the requirement to collect these documents and everything? How is online voter registration, which currently 42 states offer? Is that something that's just going to go away now that there's this requirement for everyone to, provide in person a document or upload a document? The text of the act is kind of squishy in terms of whether the registration and the document have to be simultaneous or if you can follow up or something like that. So answering all of these questions are just one of the many things to kind of work out with respect to implementation of the act if they were ultimately passed.
Thank you all. I'm going to rush through a few of these questions and get to as many of them as possible. This person asked, if the SAVE Act passes, would registered voters need to re-register in order to vote? What would that look like? Do we know?
The answer is no, people would not need to re-register. The voter rolls would remain as they are, with the caveat that anyone who updates their registration will be subject to these new rules. You move down the street, you need your passport or birth certificate. So that's something that in the long run, even in the short run, and is going to have a big impact. Some communities, I will say, are more transient than others, such as younger voters, lower income voters who don't own a home. And that's another way that the burdens don't fall equally.
Absolutely. This person asked, in states where they're attempting to coordinate with DMV data to minimize negative impacts, what impact does that have on third-party voter registration drives? Is it then sufficient for third-party groups to collect those forms with driver's license numbers on them as proof of citizenship versus the National SAVE Act, where third-party drives are virtually impossible since proof of citizenship needs to be provided directly to election officials?
So, in theory, the DMV coordination does provide a pathway for third-party registration to be provided for those folks that DMV can, give the verification of citizenship. This is something, Arizona has been doing a proof of citizenship requirement for about 20 years now, and they do, still have third-party drives. They do have the additional burdens that come with that proof of citizenship requirement, but those folks can go out, collect the DMV or MVD, I forget what it's called out in Arizona, can collect that information, which can then go back to election officials. And as long as election officials can verify the necessary information through the motor vehicle records, then they can complete the full registration transaction.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. This next question, I'm going to kind of combine two questions. Somebody asked about the provisions, if they could advance through Congress in a reconciliation process. And somebody asked Somebody else asked about the Purcell principle, which I'm honestly not familiar with. So I pass that. If that is way too in the weeds, also you can tell me, and we can adjust that. But really, what could this look like? Is there a path for this to pass? Yeah, what are the possibilities there? The reconciliation process or the Purcell principle, if you're able to speak to that.
I can try to take those both quickly, perhaps a little overconfidently. I'll do Purcell first. Purcell is a legal principle that applies in court cases, that courts should not change the rules of the election too close to the election. Purcell does not apply to legislation, so it's not relevant here. That idea, of course, is one that makes a lot of sense. The way it's applied by courts creates a lot of problems. They're extremely inconsistent about it. I'll leave that discussion there, but know that Purcell would not be a factor for legislation. As for reconciliation, again, to just overly simplify things, that is a process in the Senate that allows them to pass things with a simple majority, meaning they get around the 60-vote filibuster that applies only to certain types of funding legislation. The SAVE Act is not funding legislation. To the best of my knowledge, reconciliation is simply not available to pass the SAVE Act. And I do believe congressional leadership has thus far agreed with that take. You know, the Senate can ultimately do what it wants if it can get to 50 votes, but doing that has been really hard when it comes to this legislation.
Thank you so much for taking that curveball. Didn't mean to get all the vocab, all the all of those terms. Great. Somebody else asked, is it true that states that allow most or even all voters to vote by mail have a higher percentage of turnout in elections than states where there are restrictions to voting? And how might that be impacted if this is mostly question about vote by mail, and we're talking registration here, but I know even showing IDs at the polls and things like that could be impacted here. Can any of you speak to that?
Well, to the general question around turnout, we can certainly speak to the number that we find that states that give citizens ready access to eligible voters access to a variety of voting methods, whether that's voting by mail, whether that's a robust early voting period, or whether that's sufficient in-person election day voting. That you do see turnout higher in states like maybe like an Oregon or Washington, where eligible registered voters are mail ballots, or even thinking of states like Arizona, where voters have to apply for ballots, but that's something that's eligible for every registered voter, and you have approximately 80% of their votes cast are either by mail or in person early. All of that's covered under what they call early voting in Arizona, and you see it in states across the country, cross the partisan divide in terms of providing that access. It generally is the case that the more that you open up different voting methods to eligible citizens, that you will see increases in turnout.
Thank you for the swift answers to all of these. As I said, there's so many questions. I wish we could get to all of them, but I want to just give you all a chance to just as a closing here, because we are close on time. Is there anything else that nonprofit leaders should know about this? And know that I'm about to share a link where they can contact their senators. But just a quick round here to close us out. What anything else that hasn't been mentioned that you think needs to be included? And Olivia, I'll start with you.
Sure. I think that we really need to counter the narrative around this. You have to be a citizen to vote. Non-citizens aren't voting. There isn't a problem. We do not need draconian laws to make it harder for people to cast their constitutional rights. And so I think fighting back with letters to the editor in other communications way to sort of inoculate the narrative around this, and to really make sure you're providing the fact-based information about what voters need in order to cast their ballot. So I think just trying to do all of what you can do to communicate with your friends, neighbors, and everyone you know.
Thank you so much, Olivia. I'll pass to you, Daniel.
Yeah, keeping my state focused eye in place, I'll say that with the Save America Act, there may not be a path for it to get through Congress, but these kinds of bills aren't going anywhere in the states. They're going to be bubbling up. If your state hasn't already passed one, they're going to be trying to do so, certainly probably ahead of the 2028 presidential election. So if your state hasn't passed one, get engaged in that legislative process and let your legislators know, what these impacts are going to be, for eligible voters. And how, what the real impact is going to be likely is leaving out a lot of eligible citizens rather than maybe capturing the very, very few ineligible folks who might even, be registered on the polls. Think about that. And if your state has passed a bill like this already, then, be super vigilant about implementation, lift up any issues that are coming up, try to, get legislative fixes where you can, get administrative fixes where you can, so that, if your state wants to go down this path, you want it to be as minimally disruptive for the eligible citizens' ability to vote that you would want.
Yeah, thank you so much. Andrew, bring us home.
Sure. I mean, those are both really fantastic points by Olivia and Daniel. I'll just add on, there are already a lot of systems and checks in place to make sure that only eligible American citizens are voting in our elections. Let me just give you one example. It's a crime in every state to register for state elections if you're not a citizen. It's a crime under federal law to do that. It's another crime under state law to actually vote in an election if you're not a citizen, and it's a crime under federal law to vote if you're not a citizen. Are you willing to go to jail for years and most likely be deported for one vote? This is a very, very serious deterrent. And I think so often when we have these conversations, people come at it from a vantage place of people are just going around that. You are handing the government a record of the crime you are committing if you register and or vote if you are not a United States citizen. There are other things. There are various forms of voter verification, including ID requirements in many states. Other states use things like signature matching that make it very hard to commit fraud, let alone on a broad scale. We do audits after our elections in which we make sure everything lines up the way it's supposed to. There have been a lot of investigations, including by states, looking for the supposed voter fraud, and over, they don't find it. We have systems, they work really well. We do not need to add massive hurdles to the eligible voters to stop a non-problem.
Thank you so much. The three things that I'm taking away from this are really pay attention and use resources that you have and work together in coalitions. You're not alone in this. Some of you all nonprofit leaders may not be as connected, but please do connect with others and then take any actions that you can to ensure that this does not move forward. And with that said, I'll share here our call to action. We have a tool that you can use to send a letter to your senator, to either one of your senators, urging them to reject the SAVE Act. You can also share, we've got some sample letters that you can share out with your community via social media. If you have an newsletter or something like that. And then also if you want to find out if you have one of these bills that's being considered in your state, the Voting Rights Lab tracker that Daniel had mentioned is linked there. And also I believe Cheyenne, our fabulous stage manager of the day, is sharing that in the chat as well. So that is your call to action. It should be something pretty easy you can do in the next few minutes here once we close out this webinar. So thank you in advance for taking action and doing what you can. As just a reminder, there is a survey after this that will pop up. We just always want to hear your feedback. We really do read these and take your suggestions. Last year, we heard lots of calls for how do we talk with voters? And then our first webinar of this year was about how to talk to voters. So we do read these and really appreciate when you all give that. Let me just close us out with a big round of applause to our panel. Thank you, Andrew and Daniel and Olivia, so much for your time and expertise here. I know that there are so many more questions we hoped to get to, and so their information about their organizations is in the chat. So please do follow up specifically if you have more questions there. And don't forget to follow the work of Nonprofit Vote. We'll have our next webinar coming out to you all very soon. And take that action. And thank you all so much. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.